Hello, I'm Svitek, 360 Creative Coach, and welcome to my vlog, where it is both my mission and my pleasure to highlight my creative journey in hopes of inspiring you, giving you specific takeaway, all that way your journey can be at least a little bit easier. Now, before I fully dive into things, I would like to take the opportunity to invite you to subscribe if you haven't already. That way you get all of my various lessons and episodes that I put out when I put them out. Thank you if you just did, and thank you if you already were. It truly does mean a lot to me, as I hope it does to you. So, let's get into this. Lots of things going on, lots of moving parts. Some projects are coming to a close, months later, even though, months ago they, in theory, mentally would have been preferable to have them done, and I'll talk about that stuff. Slowly making progress on new projects, right? That ongoing transition from old projects to new projects. And as far as new projects, I've been in the writing phase, right? So just to give you an overview, I'm working on a story that is intended to be a trilogy of movies. So I'm working on plotting out that, right? And I'm working on my second novel. And so I'm in the midst of writing that slowly but surely. And one of the things that I thought about and identified this past week was the goal of my writing really isn't necessarily to make progress. It is to do it so I can identify the problems with it and fix them. And in essence, the more progress I make in any given session, the more problems I can identify and allow my creative brain, when I'm walking around or driving or doing anything else, to just do its work and think about those things, right? Because oftentimes, that's what happens to me is, when I'm not doing the actual activity, ideas will just generate and pop up. Well, it also only allows me to think of the stuff that I'm aware of are problems, right? And so, the more problems that I can identify, then my brain is allowed to do its work in that sense. And I bring this up because a lot of times writers that I talk to, or would-be writers, they talk about how hard the process is, and it is very hard. And part of what discourages them is when they write, it doesn't come out perfect. And that's the trick of writing, is that we go through this process, this arduous process, to get to a point where the finished product seems so effortless and inevitable and natural and gripping and so forth, right? Like the story that we want to read, or, in the case of a movie, the story that we want to see, that we're in awe of the talents of the writer. But the talent is not the ability to just create. It's the ability to persist and revise, getting it to that point where it seems that the person is so talented, like they made it up on the spot, right? And in that sense, if the goal is to, get there, well, progress is that vehicle to identify those problems so you can fix them. At least it is for me. But I think it's a nuanced way to look at it. And by doing so, it releases this tension for me where, whatever I have to write has to be great. It's like, no, the goal is just to, initiate and, put down just whatever the best idea in the moment is and be like, okay, well, clearly I don't have a better, if I was a comedy writer, like I don't have a better joke here or setup or whatever, but here's what I got right now, and I'll just, maybe put need a situation where character A does this to character B. Boom. And then it's like, okay, cool, I'll just kind of continue. And then the pieces will start to fall into place. Right? And that's the way I think writing can be looked at, where it isn't so daunting. anything just to keep the ball moving forward. That's sort of my philosophy for myself, and and sometimes what I tell others. And, it's kind of funny because, there was someone I was working with, and I was like, you know what, just literally write 100 words a day, right? Just 100 words a day. And they were like, well, that's not a lot at all. I'm like, exactly, that's the point. But guess what? For like 6 months you've been talking about writing and you haven't written anything. So, if in that time you had written 100 words a day, you'd be a lot further along, wouldn't you? So, in that sense, yeah, that's sort of how I view the process. And this past week, sometimes it's good for me to revisit just good storytelling truths, if you will, not rules for writing, but just principles that have stood the test of time. And so I'm going to go over them with you of, ones that have been very helpful for me. Some of them are new. Others are ones I knew before. Some of them are variations of what I used to know, right? And I'm going to go over them in one moment. But before, I want to do some quick housekeeping, right? So speaking of, projects, I made a movie, my second feature film called A Bogota Trip. And, if you've been following me, you've heard me talk about this. It's about two sets of American tourists who bump into each other in Colombia, and then it's a will they, won't they type of story. But it goes so much more than that. And we have our next festival screening. This is in Las Vegas. And it is this Sunday, October 30th at 12 p.m. And you can get tickets at tinyurl.com/Bogota Trip Vegas. Just search for block YY. So that's 2 Ys. And yeah, you can check us out. And if you didn't get all that, don't worry. All that information is in the description. So, you can get that there. There's a link provided. You can click it. But yeah, why not spend Halloween weekend in Vegas and also enjoy our movie? It'd be great to see you. It'd be great to have you see the movie. I think you would enjoy it. So yeah, that is the next opportunity. We do have other potential screenings, but we won't know from these festivals for a while, actually. So here is the next available opportunity, right? So take it if you'd like. All right, so let's talk about helpful story principles, right? So character activity. Character activity is what characters do. And a major mistake people think is that character and plot are different. No, they are really synonymous. Characters need to take action, otherwise a movie would be boring. And the plot is driven by the characters, because if it's not, it feels forced and it feels untrue to the world being created. And so the way to understand story and characters is to write from the inside out. What do the characters want? And oftentimes what they say they want is not what they actually want or even need. And so knowing that distinction, right, and being able to identify that. And something that has been coming to fruition for me with the writing that I've been doing is this idea of change comes from two opposing forces, right? Divisiveness, if you will. And I think that's just one of the reasons why I wanted to identify that, because I think that's a good general note in life. We think divisiveness is this negativity, when in reality, most things that, grow, evolve, and so forth, comes from, a clashing of ideologies. And it's in how you handle that disagreement and work towards that solution that can be the positive or negative of it, talking it out versus violence. But I think too often I know certainly from my life, when people bring up a criticism, they might be termed as negative, not part of the team, and so forth, when, again, it can actually help the team, and you need those types of people to be part of the discussion. And in fact, one of my best friends, he just seemingly always takes a contradictory view to my own, and we get into this, oftentimes very heated discussions, and, afterwards, like, we'll just like go fully at it, and then afterwards, we'll let our guard down and be like, love you, buddy, love you, type of thing. And, I think we've gotten to that place because I recognize that is beneficial to me, because I wasn't always like that, and, used to kind of remain upset, if you will, and wouldn't tell the other person how much I appreciated them, that I actually enjoyed those discussions, and it forced me to think. And even if I didn't change my mind, it forced me to come up with better justifications for my own thoughts and so forth. And so, that became a big moment in my life, making sure that I identified that moment of like, hey, I don't always say it, and I know it can feel in the moment like we're just butting heads, but actually this is really awesome and truly beneficial to me, and I love this because of these reasons. So if I don't say it enough, know that is true. And you need those people in your life, right? Same as you need people that can help uplift you and don't do that to you, right? There's a time and place for everything, but, good stuff can come out of divisiveness. And speaking of characters, a big component when it comes to characters is, are they fully fleshed out? Are they just one-dimensional? Things of that nature, right? And certainly when you work in film, you want to have, if you want to attract good actors to roles, you want to give them something to work with. But what does that really mean to have dimension? I think people get it confused of, just creating quirkiness and so forth, or whatever it may be. But true character dimensionality means having contradictions, because we all are contradictory, right? And it just depends in what ways. The example that Robert McKee cites in his book Story is that, what if you had a New Yorker, a person that gets to New York, right, and they hop into a cab, and this cab driver, seems very nice. They, give tips, are jovial, talkative, and all that, right? Just seems like a salt of the earth person. But then they drop them off at a completely different location, a dangerous location, and take their money. Now, that's created a contradiction, right? They seem one way, but actually are not. And so that is what leads to, true characters. So, and characters can have many, many dimensions, right? But at the same time, you don't want to dilute it where you have 500 contradictions and then you're unable to actually move the story forward because it's all over the place, trying to catch these character dimensions, right? So, like all things, there's a balance there. It's kind of like if everything means something, then it doesn't mean anything at all, sort of thing, right? Okay, so the next sort of very helpful principle for writing, periodic sentences are the best sentences, especially when it comes to dialogue. And what that means is when, let's say, we watch a movie, we kind of can anticipate what a person is saying, right? And then we might tune out. But with a periodic sense, the crux of what they're saying is said at the end. So let's take a simple example. I'm just going to make something up on the spot. Let's say a character says, "I can't believe you did it." Right? So it becomes that declarative statement. As an audience, we might not know what that is yet. Maybe we do based on past reference. But it identifies exactly what, and so I can't believe that you did it, right? So now we structure the sentence where we have a noun, a verb, and in this case, a pronoun, right? And I can't believe that you did that. So what it does is it makes makes the audience sort of on the edge of their seat, waiting to hear the sentence, right? They don't want to miss it. As opposed to if you structure it differently, then they can start to tune out because the rest of it doesn't need to be there or whatever. And this is also another reason why when you write dialogue, it's beneficial to break it up into shorter sentences, so that way you don't have a run-on and can create these periodic types of sentences. So yeah, have that help you as it may. Another thing that I was reminded of was this Hitchcock quote, right? Alfred Hitchcock, the great director. And he proclaimed once that when the screenplay is written and the dialogue has been added, you're ready to shoot. Now, that might not seem obvious of the importance of that, but let's break it down, right? So when the screenplay is ready and the dialogue has been added, the reason that in itself is the important part. And by the way, that's a periodic sentence too, because shoot becomes the thing you're waiting for. When becomes like this declarative statement. So you're like, okay, wondering when what and for what? Well, when the screenplay has been written and the dialogue added, we're ready to shoot. So anyway, just wanted to kind of underscore that. But a lot of times people fall in love with their dialogue, right? And they try to force dialogue and situations into stories. And then that's when things become didactic, that's when things become contrived and so forth, because you're just trying to shoehorn in the stuff. As opposed to creating a story and making it the best story that you can, figuring out, plotting it, outlining it, then start creating a treatment for it, and so forth. And then once you get to the writing phase, you know everything that's going to be happening. And so the dialogue becomes that much more naturalistic, because it's in fitting and keeping with driving the story, right? Characters say lines of dialogue. And if characters are plot and plot is character, then the dialogue they say has to be true to them and at the same time drive the plot forward. And when you do it from that perspective of focusing on the story and not what the characters themselves are saying, I mean, you have to understand like who the character is. And so in your dossier, you might obviously have like, they speak with a Southern accent or a New York accent or whatever it is, right? So you have those types of principles, like who the person is, but you're not writing specific dialogue for them for the story. You just have this general sense of like what their motto is, or whatever, right? Like just their overall speech patterns. And so you craft the story around that. Knowing who your characters are, how they react in situations, therefore driving the plot forward. And once you have all that, then you write the screenplay with the dialogue and it feels true. That's why, when the screenplay is written and the dialogue added, because dialogue in that sense is the last thing to really be tinkered in that way. And it feels, as I said, truer to what the actual story is for those reasons, because you weren't focused on it and you weren't shoehorning in that stuff. So that's why that's a very important and sometimes overlooked, in fact, many times overlooked piece of advice. Another big thing when it comes to writing, this I was reminded of this because one of my friends, he had written this screenplay and he shared it, just a tiny little snippet, and I jokingly said to him, like, because in the script it just said they walk out, and I was like, is there a better verb for that? They walk out, and it might be nitpicky in that sense, but I think too many times we put in adjectives. They walk slowly, they walk quickly, or something like that, to try to give it a sense of context. But really, it's about picking the correct nouns and verbs. All right, this is where writing talent comes in, and also just spending the time to make sure you pick out those right things. Like, this is why writing takes time. Having a Hemingway-esque knack for getting down to the bone, as opposed to, like, they hammer a big nail, say he beats a steak, right? So a steak is, a big nail. It gives a weight to it. Exactly, like a big nail doesn't really showcase, well, how big, right? As opposed to a steak, you exactly know the size of it. Instead of saying move slowly, what about they saunter, right? So being very purposeful and deliberate with your nouns and your verbs. So that way you avoid adjectives, and it makes the reader that much more engaged. And if it is a screenplay, then certainly the actor can look at that and be like, okay, cool. You're directing them without over-directing them. Like, you're giving them exactly what they need for that scene, and boom. Okay, cool. I can do that. So, yeah, that's a big one. And it's a hard one because I read, I don't read as many screenplays, but I read a lot of books, and there's plenty of times, I can tell, like, the great writers take the care to select the right nouns and verbs, so that way they avoid adjectives and adverbs. And the not so good ones, kind of skip over that. So take that for what you will. The last one I want to talk about is this idea: never use the same trick twice. And this is more for filmmaking, and it comes from James Cameron. More specifically, I was watching the behind-the-scenes making of Titanic, and watching it just really just made me appreciate what they did. They pulled off so much and created so many new techniques. They could have failed at so many different times with this movie, and yet they succeeded. Certainly, from a production standpoint. The story, I think could have been improved here and there. But certainly from the technical aspect, it is a true marvel to take in. And part of how they achieved that was that guiding principle of never use the same trick twice. So whenever they created something and would essentially fool the audience, it's like a magician. Now the audience is going to be tuned in for that. And if you do it again, they're going to see it as a trick, and it's going to break that illusion, that suspension of disbelief that, that these actors are on the real Titanic. And so to avoid that, they literally used every trick in the book and had to, in fact, invent quite a number of them to pull off these things. And I think that's a good piece of advice, and one that, in some sense, instinctually, I guess I kind of stuck to it when I think about it. And, obviously, I I haven't done it to the level of him or Titanic or even just most movies, but, filming scenes when the actors aren't there, but cheating in such a way where you're shooting over one person's shoulder and they have a piece of clothing to see the next and making it look like they're connected. Using green screen to put people together in a scene. Excuse me. And all kinds of stuff to make it seem like, people are at a location or whatever it may be, right? All these kinds of things, I'd been doing. And perhaps maybe I did it as an instinct because I love magic. And magic and movie making to me are very synonymous in many ways, right? But yeah, I think that's worthwhile to keep in mind, as a filmmaker. Never use the same trick twice. It doesn't mean not, you can use it across movies, but just in the same movie, you don't want to use it multiple times. So yeah, those are kind of the helpful principles that I've been thinking about that have helped shape what I'm working on. And, I don't know if it was because of this or I'm getting into the sort of final deadline of it all, but, if you've been following me, I've been working on a 90-second pitch for the trilogy that I talked about, with that I'm working on. And this 90-second pitch has to essentially convey what all three movies are about, enough where you get the characters, the emotional weight of what and why people are doing it, get you interested, and all that. And really, you're doing this in like 200 to 220 words, depending on the size of your words and how fast you speak. You don't want to speak too fast, so it can range from like 180 to 220, let's say, words. That's not a lot of words to convey quite a lot. And, I've been posting various drafts of this pitch on my Patreon page, patreon.com/Phil Svitek. For those of you who are curious, that's one of the benefits is kind of behind the scenes access, look at some of this stuff. And, for a while, it was working overall, but the emotional weight wasn't as big as I'd liked it to be. And certainly the ending didn't have the gravitas that I was aiming for. And finally this week, the dam broke open, right? I think now I'm at a place where okay, maybe it can be improved in ways, but even if it's not, this feels really, really good. And I feel really good about delivering this one, right? So yeah, and that journey of when you're working with so few words, I think that's what made me really appreciate just the choices made in verbs and nouns and being very selective and just really appreciating the writing process in a completely different way because, as I said, 220 words is not a lot to convey this information. So you have to be very deliberate with every single line that you put in. Because even if you put in like a 5-word sentence, that could be 3 seconds you're essentially wasting. Or it might send the audience in a different direction, right? It has to be clear enough where, they can imagine certain things, but not in a way where now all of a sudden their minds are wandering and they're no longer listening. It's a very, in a way, it's like marketing. Great marketing is a creative act, as opposed to being cookie cutter. So, that's the way I kind of approached it. Speaking of marketing, one of So this past week rather, I saw Triangle of Sadness, which is this black comedy film made by the same person who made Force Majeure and The Square, if you're familiar. And I absolutely loved it. And what I loved about it is that it was funny, but it had something to say. And I think too often times we look at movies, if they aren't like truly deeply serious from start to finish, that they're not as valuable, that they're not as good, let's say. I mean, just look at the Oscars. You know, in the Best Picture category, there's not comedies, and it's like, why do we devalue comedies? Now, you know, in this sense, it was very humorous, and therefore it allowed us to see aspects of our world in a different light, but in a true light. And it opens up with these male models. And in one of the funniest scenes I've seen in a while about, you know, one of the models gets asked, you know, is this campaign for a happy brand or a grumpy brand? He's like, what do you mean? Well, happy brand means, you know, that you're smiling, it seems attainable, the product is, you know, relatively cheap, as opposed to a grumpy brand where, you know, you're looking down on your consumer. And, you know, they brought up, like, the happy brand became, like, H&M, and the grumpy brand became, like, Balenciaga, right? And it's just such an interesting observation that is so true, but I hadn't, like, noticed in the world that, like, gave it definition. And so I loved it. And I'm going to, you know, this is a movie that I absolutely enjoyed, and I think it was great because I didn't know much going into it other than that it looked like a great movie, and people spoke very highly of it. And that was enough to get me in the door, and where it went was just a thrill ride. It was a true roller coaster experience of a movie with the audience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But using kind of models, and, you know, I've kind of been talking a little bit about marketing. One of the interesting things that I consider is this idea that many people try to be brands. And the problem is, people aren't brands. They're humans. So we talked about dimensionality, right? As a character case, and creating interesting characters. And listen, I'm not this expert on social media or marketing or things of that nature. But at the same time, I do know what I want for myself. And I also observe people that are termed influencers have to act and only post certain things because, you know, they pigeonholed themselves into thinking they are just a brand and so forth. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You know, like people that make money off of social media by being influencers. My bigger thing is, like, what are you influencing, right? Like, just, you know, you can't just be an influencer. You have to have the subtext of, well, what's the thing, right? You know, you could be a person that loves, like, I've seen people that love math and teach math, and they're influencers in that way, right? I think the obvious one is like clothing and, you know, sneakers or just apparel in general. But I think it can go beyond that. So, you know, whenever someone says that they want to be an influencer, it's like, well, what's an influencer of what? Anyway, I know I'm kind of rambling and going every which way, but for me, I don't know. For me, it doesn't resonate to look at myself as like one thing. And, you know, people have certainly identified that in me, that I do quite a lot, you know, and I use the term 360 creative coach in part because I do recognize that I have to have some branding around it. And I do like that idea, like 360 implies, you know, essentially everything, but I'm a human. I have many, many interests that, yeah, sometimes contradict themselves. that, I like soccer, I like movies, I like anime, I like, nature, like all these different things. Like I'm not just one thing. And it's in fact why I think there's this term that like people say he's not like that in real life. So meaning, at work, they might be a little bit more stern and so forth, but quote unquote, when they're not at work, aka real life, they're not stern. And I don't know, I think it's BS, because it's like, why are we making the distinction between, what does that mean, real life versus not real life? Like when they're at work, they're not real life? I just think it's a bullshit term, because we have a multitude of personalities, and we often fit our personalities towards a situation, right? This is where like understanding character dimensionality comes in. You have to, like, when we're trying to achieve something, part of the tactic is switching up our approach. And so, yeah, how we act at work might be different than how we act with our family, for the very reason we have different goals within that. And different pressures, if you want to term it as such. And that's what makes us human. And that's why I think, like, to just pigeonhole a person into like this brand, no, you're human. And one of the reasons I even bring this up is because, again, listen, if people are happy in their life, great. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. And like, that's what we want. But oftentimes, there's certain people that just get so stressed out about the idea of having to just maintain their status as a brand when they're a real person. And when they let their guard down and kind of showcase the different sides of them, sometimes the audience is like, oh, it's great to like know your personality. And I think that's a great aspect of social media that can really be beneficial, is when excuse me, when we embrace ourselves and kind of let people in. Listen, let people in doesn't mean you can define that how you may. I think Gary Vee is very open on his process, but his personal life, his kids, his family, and so forth, very private. In many ways, I'm open with the stuff that I choose to be, but the other ins and outs, no. So you get to define that ultimately. I think that, I don't know. I think it's an idea that I haven't necessarily fully fleshed out, but just the idea that, no, you're not a brand, you're a human, and the idea that, like, just act like it, embrace that. I think will lead more people to happiness than not. All right, so getting back to Triangle of Sadness, one of the things that it made me appreciate was that foreign markets, foreign film studios, unlike Hollywood, there's an inherent value of art which allows them to take bigger swings. And I really, really love that. I've started to look at that and appreciate that as a movie maker myself, right? And so, as I kind of consider things, because oftentimes when it comes to the film market here, people will say, well, it is a business at the end of the day. And it's like, that's true here. But, obviously, like, everything wants to make money and so forth. But the fact that there's like actual grants within Europe to just go and make interesting art for the sake of it, that appeals to me. And, I think as I continue, like all things that I try to do, is combine the best of any world, right? And so there's plenty of things I like about the Hollywood system, but the big swing aspect and all that, I like that about foreign territories. And so for me, it's like, okay, how do I combine that to create the stuff that I want? That's kind of like what I've been thinking about and how to navigate within all of this. And if nothing else, one of the things that I can declaratively say is I really don't want Hollywood to continue to remake foreign movies. They did it with Force Majeure. Will Ferrell was in the Americanized version, and it was just so watered down. They're trying to do this with a movie called Another Round, which was about a group of teachers that experimented with the benefits of alcohol. Like, at what point did drinking become inhibitive, as opposed to just being buzzed, where they could actually teach better, right? It's an amazing, amazing movie. And they want to remake that. And I just think the remakes, they don't capture the magic, the spirit of what the original is. And the original already exists. So as audience members, I encourage you to actually see the original piece of work of these foreign movies. I love foreign cinema, as I said. I really have just more and more of a true appreciation, because they just take these big swings, and when they succeed, it's magical. It really is. So, yeah, I've been kind of thinking about that. Some of the more, let's say, nebulous mental stuff that I've been thinking about is this idea of gratitude versus entitlement. Whenever we feel like we have something, take an example of buying a lottery ticket. And if in your heart you feel like this is mine, when in reality, you never had it to begin with, and then you find out that, in fact, you did not win, there's this gap that opens up within you that, as if something was taken. You had it, but it was taken. When in reality, you didn't have it. You just kind of assumed that you had it, and now you're feeling sad and angered by it not being true. And that's why I think, I continue, how I look at gratitude and the role that it plays in my life really has been beneficial, because I don't look at anything as if it should be handed to me. I aspire to many, many things, and will keep working towards those things. But when they don't come, I'm not upset by them as much as I used to be. Not always, but as a general rule, that's the trajectory that I'm headed and want to continue to head on, Because one of the things that I've realized in this year is I've had the biggest number of wins this year, and I've also had the biggest number of, losses. And what I mean by that is, just on a career trajectory, in this past year, I've put out my first novel. I finished my second movie, A Bogota Trip. We've been a part of already various festivals. We've gotten some victories with the festivals. As I made note earlier, we're having another screening this Sunday, October 30th at 12 p.m. In Vegas. And, all those feel great. And yet there's also the negative aspects of the world, but also just from a career perspective, as many of the festivals that we've so far gotten in, there's a lot that we haven't. And just in general within this business, you face a lot of rejection. I'm talking about, I talked about the pitch for my trilogy. This is all so that I can, practice it and hopefully, in time actually pitch it to try to get some finances for it, and we'll see. And a lot of that can be rejections, but hopefully there's enough there that I get at least one yes, or maybe two, ideally, or whatever. Maybe I listen. Ideally, of course, all of them would be yeses, but not always going to be the case. But that's an interesting. I like the corollary between this year is the most victories I've had as well as the most losses. And I think I say corollary because I'm taking those swings. And I've worked very hard to get to this place to have these various projects in contention to be able to get those victories as well as the losses. And some people, obviously, there's that adage, if you never try, then you can't fail. And I think that is what keeps people down. Listen, the rejections and the fails, they don't feel good. They didn't. But I have learned to shift my mindset and just embrace it as part of the process, because it does get me to those victories. Winston Churchill had this quote that success is going from failure to failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And I do try to embody that. And, one of the things that I've had to get my mind around is this idea that sometimes my will is not enough. Let's say when I played sports, specifically soccer, but I also did some track in high school. But I could the rules of the game were defined. And so I knew the objective, and I knew how to win, and I knew how to push my body and everyone else to try to get those victories. In real life, we play by an undefined set of rules, ultimately. Players are both known and unknown. And so, my will sometimes isn't good enough. I could do all the right things to try to get accepted into a film festival, let's say. But doesn't mean, I get in. There's not a certain checklist that they're looking for in terms of, a movie. They might. They're not going to let you know what it is. At least not beyond hey, feature film is anywhere between 60 minutes to 120. It needs to have, if it's not in English, it needs to have subtitles, just the basic requirements, right? And that's okay, That's where perseverance comes in. Of okay, yep, all right, this didn't work out. We'll call it, you could term it as a failure, right? I don't think of it that way necessarily, but for all intents and purposes, as part of the definition, a rejection can be a failure. And it's okay, cool, on to the next, without loss of enthusiasm. That's, in essence, perseverance to me. And that's how I really like to look at it, just this ability to keep going, keep trying, and seeing it through to the victories. So that the overall is victory in spite of the many losses along the way. It's if it was war, it'd be we may have lost the battle, but we're not going to lose the war type of thing. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about. Another, I just want to kind of say this, since more and more I've been really thinking about history and learning from history to better set myself up to anticipate things and also just deepen my writing. But there's this quote. History is the symptom and we are the disease. And I thought about that. I like that because, there's that term that might be more familiar of history repeats itself. And it's well, why does history repeat itself? Well, because it's a symptom of our disease. And when you really kind of think about that, it's okay, well, what's our disease? And in a broad sense, is that we're not at inner peace with ourselves, and we have this hatred towards the world. We always otherize an aspect of the world and think the world needs to change as opposed to ourselves. And I'm being a little bit more broad with it, maybe not always, but in general, that seems to be the consensus. And so for me, whenever I get upset with the world, it's like, okay, well, what can I change about myself, and what can I do to help change that, as opposed to, oh, well, the world needs to be better and I'm perfectly fine. So whatever that's worth, that's something I've been thinking about, especially as, elections are coming up, as the state of the world, continues to be the way that it is. And, within all of this, I do try to ask myself, like, what's the maximum effect I can have where, yes, my time is limited, but I don't want to just at the same time do the bare minimum, right? Because I think sometimes people get lost in that way of it, and we end up just with a gluttony of banal posts and think the same things, whereas whatever the issue is, for me, I at least try to really observe it, look at it, examine it, understand it, and then reflect on it to create, in my own words, even if it is the same thing as everybody else, but add my own way of it to showcase an effort. I was talking with one of my friends, Jesse, and we were talking about just how Facebook, just allows you to write happy birthday to somebody. And, and not that we were disagreeing, we were just like kind of bringing up our observations. And he was saying how he just hates that because it's such a minimal thing, and it's like it doesn't even matter. And I was like, well, the irony is it's so simple, and yet so few people do it. Even just putting that bare minimum effort actually can brighten someone's day, and that's why I try to do it. So it's it's very interesting, and I think there's something to be said, and I think people recognize when someone does put in the effort versus somebody that doesn't. When it's a copy and paste versus, hey, you actually took a little bit of time, even if you didn't say or do a lot, just the thought of doing it and having done it represents something greater. So, yeah. All right, so to round things out, just a few quick things. One of the things that I've been sort of wildly fascinated with is artificial technologies and the advancements being made in that. And, as we close out the year and perhaps into the new year, I really want to focus on what's out there and how can it help me with the things that I'm doing. There's this thing called Midjourney that my friend Jonathan Moulton was showing me. And it's not perfect. It's basically a tool that allows you to create sketches. And it's not perfect, but, I was saying to him, like, if you're a storyteller of any kind, like, it can create some great just conceptual designs just to get you started. And so I want to really explore that space and see what's available and how I can utilize it, right? I think certainly as a filmmaker, there are all these tools, and sometimes we shy away from technology, but technology can liberate us and do quite a lot more. And for me, it's always, whenever I've embraced these trends, that has allowed me to create great work for cheap, because I can, piece together and see a utilization of these things that, some people might have been using, but on a higher scale, and I can figure out the low cost of it, or I can combine two things to create something that was unintentional and put it together, right? So I'm really excited about that exploration. And if you know of any awesome tools, please comment down below, or hit me up on social media at Svitek. Let me know. Like, I would love to, put them on my list and deep dive some of this stuff. And, if you can be specific with, what it is and what you're using it for, or why it's of interest to you, then that'd be awesome. The last part, I talked about gratitude. And this past week, a couple of last minute jobs came up. One where I got to go and do an interview, not me, but I was filming and setting it up for it, this interview with a great composer. And that was a lot of fun. I also went to the East LA Classic high school football game where the Black Eyed Peas played. Yes, the Black Eyed Peas played at halftime for a high school game. Incredible. I got to be a part of that, film it and just observe it. And yeah, I look at my life and I'm so grateful for all these opportunities. And in some sense, they took time away from the writing process and so forth. But at the same time, I think that's where people can get frustrated. Whereas, because they solely want to, I want to write my music, I want to do this, and they're like, I never get enough time. And yeah, the time can be limited of being able to do your own stuff. But for me, this does feed my soul, and I got paid to do both of these things, so certainly that allows me to then put that money towards things of this nature. So yeah, I don't shy away from it, and I'm not entitled to think that that I'm just gonna get to make the stuff that I want to make. I know I have to fight for that and make the time in spite of everything else to be able to do it. And for all those things, I'm grateful. So I think it's about a perspective shift. So that's what I have for you this week. Thank you as always for taking the time to tune in. I truly appreciate you. As I made mention, all the various things that I've kind of discussed, the links and so forth, you can check out more in the description box. They're all linked to there. I kind of made mention of my Patreon page, patreon.com/PhilSvitek. That's a simple way to support me while also getting more direct interaction if that's something that's value to you. Also kind of a look behind the scenes there. Or perhaps, you just want to dive straight into a full coaching session that is available to you as well. So yeah, check out all that stuff. But regardless, I will continue doing these episodes for free, so you can continue to learn and benefit from them. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. I'll see you next time.